So we've talked about trying to get some percentages, and if you look over here at project A, this will look familiar. We did this in previous chapters, and we did it at 18%. And just like we talked about at the beginning of this chapter, we are trying to figure out what is the percentage that we're going to use so that we can discount this project A and figure out what is the NPV. Okay? So what is the NPV here? The NPV here is whatever it was that we figured out in chapter 1. So it doesn't really matter. What we're looking for now is this 18%, and where does the 18% come from? So let's erase this 18% because we don't know what it is, and we don't know where it's going to come from. Let's just get rid of it altogether. And we have to ask the question, because we're going to ask the same question that we did with the NPV. We say, hey, should we take on project A? And in order to decide whether or not we take on project A using the NPV, we got to figure out whether or not that's the case. So whether or not it's an appropriate or a positive NPV. So let's begin by talking about where the money comes from. Okay? When you finance a company, you've got a whole pie of your capital structure. And let's pretend for a second that half of this money comes from equity or from shareholders, and that half of this money comes from debt. All right, so 50% comes from equity and 50% comes from debt. And so we were very happy about that, and everybody's happy and content. And remember, we talked about there's an investor out here, and he has some requirement on his return because he's putting the money in. And let's say his requirement on return is 12%, right? And on the other side, we haven't talked about this yet, there's a bank, and this is the big bad bank. And the big bad bank, oh, next maybe I can do some columns here or something with the doors, and they have a little shade. And so there's the bank, and the bank is going to lend money to the corporation. Oftentimes it won't be a bank. Oftentimes instead of a bank, we'll have bond holders, you know, instead of a bank. But the point is the same. The firm is establishing some sort of debt. And usually this return that the bank requires is like 6%. And the 6% is easy. You just walk up to the bank, you say, hey, look, I'm going to borrow some money. And they say, well, we'll lend it to you at 6%. Or if you issue bonds, the bonds will have a yield of 6%. Okay, so that's where that 6% comes from. And the 12% comes on the equity side. It comes from the requirement of the individuals. And how do we take advantage of this? Well, we've got to figure out how we meet both of these requirements at the same time. And the way we do that is by, first we note that we've got to make this 12%, right? So I've got to pick projects that are at least 12%. But the banks don't necessarily want you to take that big of a risk in your project. So we've got this extra project, project A. Right, project A. And project A, which is these series of cash flows, we've already talked about that, has some level of risk. And the bank says, hey, look, we don't need you to take a 12% level of risk. We need you to take a 6% level of risk because we don't care. And you say, I've got to meet this 12% on the other side. What can I do? Well, one of the things we can do is figure out what is an appropriate number to discount project A so that we both meet this half of my capital structure, right? My capital structure is where the money comes from, right? Structure. Capital structure is the whole circle. And how's the other one? So what do we do? Well, we can just divide. We can just take half. We can take the 12% plus the 6, and we can divide all of that by 2, and that tells us that we should take on projects that give us a 9% return. It's that simple. Well, let's walk through this real quick because our equation isn't going to look that simple. This 12 plus 6 divided by 2 is the same thing as saying 12 divided by 2 plus 6 divided by 2, right? Everybody with me? And that gives me 9%. So that's cool. And this is also the same thing as saying 1/2 times 12 plus 1/2 times 6. And that also gives me 9, right? No big surprise there. And then I can also say 0.5 times 12, and this is the same, times 0.5 times 6%, and that is also equal to 9. And if I go back to my original little sketch, you know what? Let me just do another one over here. if I go back to my original capital structure, this is my capital structure, I know that I've got a 50% equity and a 50% debt. We'll call this equity, E and D. And so this 50% equity here represents this 50% equity there, and this 50% from the debt represents this 50% equity there, and we're at an IPO. So everybody, does that make sense to everybody? That shouldn't be too far out of whack. And this is the way that we want to look at our WACC. Okay, so now the WACC equation. WACC, which means weighted, I typed this out earlier, obviously, weighted average cost of capital. Weighted average cost of capital is going to look a lot like this equation here. Okay, so follow me. This is going to be the percentage that comes from debt. So I'm going to say the percentage of debt, or you know what, let's do it like this. I haven't done this one before, but let's do my percentage of debt times my, you know what, let's do the equity first so we can be consistent. My percentage of equity times my required equity, right? So that's, this one is that one. 12 is my rate of equity, plus the percentage that comes from debt times my required debt, and all of that is going to be equal to my WACC equation. All right? That's relatively simple. And the reason we do it this way is because our percentages are not always going to be 50-50. It could be that 75% of my equity and debt, that 75% of my capital structure comes from equity, and that 25% of my capital structure comes from debt. And that changes things up a little bit. So how do I calculate my WACC? WACC is equal to equity percentage times rate of equity plus debt percentage times my rate of debt. And all I'm going to do here is substitute. So if I use my numbers from before, my rate of equity is, the rate of return that I require from equity is 12%, and the rate of return I require from, this is my investor, right, that requires 12%, and here's my bank, and my bank requires 6%. So I'm going to do 75% equity, so this is going to be 75, or 0.75, right, 75%, times 12%, because that's what they require, plus 25% of my capital structure comes from debt times my 6% because that's what they require. First of all, note that the 75% and the 25% add up to 100%. That is my total equity. That is my big circle here. All right, that means that I have a 100% capital structure. That's what that means. On the other hand, I have a lot of colors, obviously. My 12% return that comes from my requirement for my shareholders, and a 6% return that is my requirement for my debt holders. And so I multiply this out, and I figure out that this is the same as 75% of 12 is going to be 9, plus 25% of 6 is going to be 1.5. 6 times 0.25 equals 1.5, obviously 1.5. And my actual WACC, my required rate of return, my WACC, is going to be 10.5%. Now, why is this 10.5% higher than the 9 we got before? Because more weight is given to the equity side of my total capital structure. That's why, because it's going to be up a little closer to that 12%. Quick note, this doesn't have to be a decimal. This can be, you want this to be a decimal, and this is also a percentage rate. Just be consistent. If you're going to make this one a decimal and this one, make this one a decimal, and then just make sure to move your decimals. It's a good idea to keep your capital structure in terms of decimals so you can see what the appropriate weights are. Okay, so now that I have my WACC, my 10.5%, I can now go back and do my NPV. So I'm going to go all the way back up to the top, to my top. And I can do my regular NPV using 10.5%. So now when I do project A and I calculate for NPV, I can just type in 10.5%, and that's where the percentage to calculate NPV comes from. And so oftentimes in class, I'll make you do this. It wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility to give you some of these numbers and ask you to calculate or answer the question whether or not you should do project A. Now let me scroll back down to the bottom, because we won't always have these percentages, this 75% and the 25%. Sometimes what we're going to do is ask you to calculate based off of the total number. So let's do another one, a real similar one again. I'm going to say that I have a capital structure. Let's do the same. Let's do pretty much the same thing. 70, wait, but I don't want to give you the percentages. And say that I have $15 million in equity, and I have $5 million in debt. All you have to do here is figure out what the percentages are. And so I'm going to go back and go to my WACC. Let's pick something, a new color. I'm going to calculate my WACC a little differently. I'm going to calculate the percentages, total equity over equity plus debt, times my required equity, plus total debt over equity plus debt, times my rate of debt. Okay, so my rate of equity here, rate of equity is going to be equal to, I don't know, 18%, and my rate of debt is equal to, let's say, 5%, and see what happens. All right, so what is my total equity? My total equity is 15 million, so I'm going to go 15 over 15 plus D. What is D? D is 5 million. My rate of equity is 18 plus my rate of debt, 5 over 15 plus 5. Note that the denominators are the same, and my rate of debt is 5%. So this turns into 15 over 20 times 18 plus 5 over 20 times 5, and this turns into 3/4 times 18, or yeah, we'll go the long way, times 18 plus 1/4 times 5, which is the same as saying 0.75 times 18 plus 0.25 times 5, which gives me 0.75 times 18 is equal to 13.5 plus 5 times 1.25, 1.25, which gives me a WACC for this project, of 14.75. And now that I have my WACC, I use this as my cost of capital, or my internal rate, which is the same as my discount rate, and I use this percentage to calculate net present value. That's where the percentage comes from.